Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Joining me on this episode of Writers at Work is John W. Miller, author of The Last Manager, How Earl Weaver Tricked, Tormented, and Reinvented Baseball. John is a contributing writer to America magazine, and prior to that was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Per WSJ.com, during his time at the Journal, John reported from more than 24 countries and wrote stories on the Tour de France, the World Cup, uranium mines, Belgian beer brewing monks, old geologists, a chicken that lays giant eggs, and a hippo on death row. In addition to his writing, John is a co-director of the film Moundsville, a documentary about a West Virginia city of the same name. Baseball is a great passion. In addition to his Weaver bio, John served as a scout for the Baltimore Orioles and coached 2 teams in Brussels, Belgium in the Little League World Series tournament. You can find online many stories about the greatest game written by John for various publications. Invariably, they are a delight. I should mention here that despite the Wall Street Journal connection, John and I have never met, but as an admirer of his Weaver bio and as a big baseball fan, I'm glad to say, John W. Miller, welcome to Writers at Work. John, for our listeners who may not know, can you tell us who Earl Weaver was?
Earl Weaver was a Major League Baseball manager who primarily or only managed in the majors with the Baltimore Orioles from 1968 to 1986. He was a very successful manager, has the highest winning percentage of any manager during that time, also very transformative. Was the first manager to use analytics and data to win baseball games, and also technologically innovative, first manager to use a radar gun. Also, one of baseball's great showmen, great characters, very famous for fighting with umpires, for entertaining stadiums with his antics. And it's sort of seen as the archetype of the baseball manager, the tobacco chewing philosopher, dugout philosopher. And so for all those reasons, I thought it was a good idea to write a book about him.
Yeah, I want to talk about those things too, because I'm a big baseball fan and of a vintage that Earl Weaver was an important part of my baseball youth. But I want to really focus on the book itself. So how did the book come about? Did you have the idea? Did somebody approach you with the idea?
Really, the pivotal fact was I was covering the steel industry for the Wall Street Journal in Pittsburgh, but I played baseball in college, and my family's from Maryland. And somebody on the sports desk, Kevin Helliker, knew that I was a baseball guy who knew a lot about the Orioles, and he asked me to write Earl Weaver's obituary in 2013 after Earl Weaver died. And even though I was again covering the steel industry in Pittsburgh, and as I wrote it, I just thought, wow, this is such an incredible story, and nobody's ever done a book about this guy. Even though the book Moneyball, which is very successful, Earl Weaver is in the book Moneyball as a kind of prophet of early analytics. He's considered this great character in baseball history. But except for a book written while he was still in uniform, which was a little bit superficial, nobody had done a proper biography as his. So after that obituary in 2013, it kind of marinated. And then after I left the Wall Street Journal, I was thinking about big projects, and this was at the top of the list. And it was obviously not a sure thing that I would be able to write a good proposal and sell it. But as time went on, it became clear that this was going to work, and it was a good subject for a book.
All right, so you generated the pitch.
Yeah, I wrote the proposal, my first book proposal, really, and spent 6 months reporting it, 6 months writing it, and then 6 months unsuccessfully selling it before I found an agent who he sold it in 10 days once he believed in it.
As you know, there was a period in Wall Street Journal history, probably, let's see, in the late 80s, early 90s, that if you wrote a leader, you had a book deal by the end of the day. Yeah.
I'm familiar with that. That was also when you would get reprimanded for flying economy class, right, Jim?
Well, not me, but yeah, um, it's fascinating that you generated this story, because your interest in baseball is obvious. and not just by reading the book, but by doing research. It's clear that you have a great passion for baseball, and that doesn't always serve the writer well, does it? Sometimes it's not so great to be so passionate about the subject.
I know what you mean. I mean, I think what's relevant is that as part of me that is involved in baseball in a very non-literary, non-journalistic way. You know, I coach high school baseball right now. I have a game today at 3 p.m. And that part of me, doesn't really tolerate the other part of me being full of it, if you will. So the journalist part of me is held in check by the baseball coach part of me, and I think that avoids the pitfalls of, the so-called passion project, falling sway to somebody who gets carried away with what they don't know. I know very well what I don't know. I'm very much still learning about baseball. I'm still like humble, if you will. And I think that part of me helped the journalist part of me, stay real about the project, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. But you do have to sort of check yourself. I always thought the ideal biographical subject would be somebody that I didn't like, and that the research could persuade me to have a different opinion. Baseball has such a literary tradition, though. There's so many great baseball books. Do you have any particular favorites?
I do. I love The Dollar Sign on the Muscle, which is Kevin Crane's book about the scouting profession, written in the early 80s. I love Glory of Their Times, the oral history of early 20th century baseball. And I love the magazine writing of Roger Angell, and then obviously Tom Boswell in the Washington Post. The journal, those two are beat writers and columnists and feature writers. I would say those four bodies of work.
Yeah, wonderful. Any novels come to mind?
Uh, yes. I mean, I love The Art of Fielding, which is a pretty recent
Yeah.
novel. Um, I loved oh God, I can't remember the name. There's a St. Louis novelist who uh, wrote a book about a teen that suffers from depression, and it's a comic baseball novel. I will look it up while we're talking and tell our listeners by the end of the interview who it is. Um, but I primarily read the nonfiction with baseball.
Yeah, and Field of Dreams, I think, comes up on a lot of people's lists. The book is fairly faithful to the film is fairly faithful to the book.
Kinsella.
Yeah, yeah, with the exception that it's not James Earl Jones, it's J.D. Salinger in the book.
Yep.
But The Natural, for example, has very little to do with the film. The Natural has very little to do with the book.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I don't know of any other sport that has so many great books written about it.
There's that great line. I think George Plimpton said, "The smaller the ball, the better the writing."
That's a good one. That's a good one. So tell me about going about your research. You sort of um, had what was going to be your starting point? Childhood, or were you going to dive right into career?
Um, my starting point was geographical. Yeah, it was childhood. It was to go to the places where he had lived and chase the story there. And also, I was very mindful. This is somebody who, in baseball circles, which was going to be my readers, is pretty famous already, and there's a lot of stuff known about him. And as per my Wall Street Journal training, I wanted it to be not cliche and not derivative. So I wanted to come up with new stuff that would be surprising to people, and it would not be the same old 12 stories that everybody tells about Earl Weaver. And so that meant going back to his childhood. And luckily, Earl wrote there's actually four books to his name. There's straight up memoir. It's what you learn after you know all the counts. And then there's three books that are kind of memoir slash strategy books. There's one from the early '70s called Winning. And then there's one called Weaver on Strategy. I guess the fourth would be the bio by Terry Pluto, the Earl of Baltimore. So in those four books, there's a lot of little clues. And with the help of online digital archives, for example, I mean, in his memoir, he talks about his favorite uncle, who's a bookmaker. Well, it took like, a few, not that much research to see that this guy was a illegal baseball bookmaker and that he was a criminal of all kinds. He shot his wife once during a drunken quarrel. And so I hired a police researcher in St. Louis, went to St. Louis, and we chased up the true story of Uncle Bud, who's in the book, of course, as Earl's mentor. And from there you could sort of see how Earl's analytical thinking based on gambling evolved. So I was in St. Louis for two stints of a week each. And then I went to the minor league towns where he lived and managed. So Elmira, New York, Rochester, of course, Baltimore, Florida, where he lived the last third of his life. So I went to all these places, much as I would if I was reporting a front page story for the Wall Street Journal, where I would talk to as many people as possible and read as much as I could and look at archives and then, yeah, put it all together. I mean, I'd never written a book before, and so I kind of conceived of the book as a bunch of a bunch of leaders, to use the Wall Street Journal
Right.
word, where every chapter would take you forward chronologically in his life, but also make a wider point about something or another. So, for example, the chapter about his uncle discusses gambling in baseball as a general theme and how it might have uh, been an early form of analytics, and so on.
Yeah, I want to get back to Uncle Bud, but I do want to say that I very much enjoyed the chronological telling of the story. And it doesn't read like a 56,000 word newspaper article, but it does have that pull through. It's interesting to hear you say that was your intention, because I did find, uh, you know, once I picked up the book and started reading, it was very hard to pull out of it, because you
Well, thank
because
you.
you
That's a nice compliment.
no, you had me, your technique of writing had me uh, focused and looking forward to what was happening next. Yeah,
Yeah, I wanted each chapter to stand on its own.
yeah, yeah. Getting back to Uncle Bud, um, a psychiatrist attributed his combativeness to Uncle Bud, right? Because Uncle Bud wouldn't, when they played when they were kids, Uncle Bud would never let him win.
Yeah, that was an interview Earl gave in the early 80s as he was about to retire. And it's very interesting that Earl himself was mindful of his own story and didn't talk about his uncle much at all during his career because at that time you could be expelled from baseball for associating with gamblers. And so towards the end of his career, he gave this interview. He said, yeah, Uncle Bud, basically, I mean, he implies some kind of physical abuse, I think. He said he used to play with me and then pull me back as I was about to catch the ball or and so forth. But in the memoir, he's very clear. He says, "This is my favorite uncle. He took me to games, all the time, 4 times a week." Um, and so, yeah, you have to sort of again see what the subject himself is trying to say about their own story, and then realize, that those are actually pretty important blanks to color in there.
Yeah, you avoid the temptation. I don't know if you find this one, and I don't know if you would call this a celebrity bio, but when I read them, they usually have some sort of anecdote that opens the book and reinforces the reader's existing perception of the subject.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, it would have been natural for you to lead with Uncle Bud. Explaining. Uh, I mean, we can agree that Earl Weaver could have seemed like a maniac sometimes on the field, like completely unhinged.
Yeah, and there was a darkness there and a kind of violence that I think is rendered into comedy by sports writing, but is
Right.
actually pretty serious and not that funny.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you did not succumb to that temptation. That you let the story tell itself, and it, it I don't want to be overly flattering, but it's not peaks and valleys. It's just lots of peaks. Um, and I do admire that. I don't like to be tricked into to reading a story where there's a big splash in the beginning and then it's all flat for the rest of the way.
Yeah, I mean, I was terrified of having loose. I think what an editor of mine at the Journal used to call empty calories, if you will. So I wanted there to be like a good dose of revelation and insight, and I mean, Earl's story allows that. Like I got lucky with the subject too. There was no just enough about him to give you lots of leads, but again, nobody had done this particular project before, so I was lucky to be the first there.
Yeah, his childhood. Um, it's a kind of uh, idyllic in the sense that he lived so close to a ballpark that had two major league teams in it, And yet, it wasn't an easy childhood. And it was a
Yeah,
rough
and
and
that's
tumble. No, rough and
yeah.
tumble. Yeah.
It also it captured. I mean, I grew up in Brussels, Belgium, to Americans who had moved there in the '70s to play music, and so I always look at America as a kind of a foreign country, even though I am very much an American. And that world of pre-suburbs, pre-white flight St. Louis fascinated me because it's a geography that's been destroyed, by the suburbs, by the automobiles, the interstate highway. And so this world of crowded streets and taverns and bookies and walking to the baseball stadium, taking the trolley to school, that's a sort of middle class American existence that doesn't really exist anymore in most places. And so that really fascinated me. And then, yeah, the poverty of people like the Weavers who were always hustling, who were living like seven, eight, nine, 10 people to a house, but who were sustained by the community around them, by the opportunities, kind of street culture and street hustling. And for Earl Senior, it was washing the laundry, washing, literally carrying the jock straps of Major League Baseball players. And for the uncle, it was illegal gambling, illegal bookmaking. But it's part of the informal economy of big cities that now has been legalized and corporatized and by companies like FanDuel and DraftKings. And to sort of see, yeah, that world that's lost, but the impulses, the human impulses of baseball and gambling are still present, just not in that form.
Mm. It's ironic in a sense that the Orioles tried to. I think they were the first to try to replicate that downtown experience with Camden Yards. No.
Yeah, definitely. Integrating the warehouse there in Baltimore and putting the stadium downtown instead of in the suburbs, but with a modern kind of corporate business setup. Yeah, they were the first in '92. Um, and they tore down Memorial Stadium, of course, which was where Earl Weaver managed.
Right. Right. When did you return to America?
Not until I was 33, really. I mean,
Whoa.
I went to college in America, um, to play baseball, and then went back to Brussels. Was hired by the Wall Street Journal as a local hire on a local contract in Brussels,
Right.
and then in 2011 moved to Pittsburgh to cover the. I was the global mining and metals correspondent based in Pittsburgh. So that was when my first time living in America as an adult was in 2011 at 33.
So you didn't go to Memorial Stadium and see the
I
Orioles
did,
play?
yeah.
You
As a
did.
boy,
Okay. Okay.
my family would take me, and that's where I fell in love with baseball, and in particular the Orioles. And I was an Orioles fan in the late '80s, just as they got really bad. And so uh, I, I joke it was kind of like living in fourth century Rome and reading about Julius Caesar. The Earl Weaver was representative of this time when they were on top of the baseball world, and here was I, this poor lonely fan. And so I was just fascinated by this reign of glory. The novel I was trying to think of is called The Greatest Slump of All Time by David Carkeet.
Ah,
And
great.
it's very good about a teen that suffers from clinical depression.
Yeah, I don't know it, but I will definitely look it up. You mentioned Uncle Bud and gambling, and you make it clear in the book that there's no evidence to support any claim that Weaver bet on baseball. But as a manager, he did seem to lean on probability more than risk. And for all his shenanigans, he was fairly conservative in-game manager, wasn't he?
Yeah, so he was always looking for an edge, always looking for a way of kind of getting ahead of his opponent. And when he first took over, his sort of big idea was that the team should keep data on previous batter pitcher matchups for all their players. So he wanted to know, for example, if Book Powell, who was his great slugging first baseman, Book Powell was a 300 hitter, but if he hit like 110 against say Mickey Lolich, the pitcher for the Tigers, he wanted to know that, and then he would pinch hit for this great player, which was very counterintuitive at the time. At the time, you never took your stars out, but Earl saw that there was a sort of discretionary advantage in knowing this information. So he had the Orioles front office compile all this data, and then he would make these decisions, which would sort of puzzle onlookers. Like he liked to have Mark Belanger bat against Nolan Ryan because he knew Mark Belanger, who was a terrible hitting shortstop, actually hit 300 off Nolan Ryan. But as you say, I mean, eventually he was somebody who stopped bunting. He stopped playing so-called small ball. But all that evolved kind of slowly. I mean, when he first took over the Orioles in '68, it was a low-scoring run environment, and Major League Baseball was going through the year of the pitcher. And so for the first 5, 6 seasons, he actually bunted over league average, and then eventually realized that it was a counterproductive strategy, and became famous for saying that uh, the bunt belongs in the bottom of the closet. It should be a relic. And he became famous for waiting around for the 3-run homer. But again, all that happened progressively. And what makes him a great character is that he was always changing, evolving. He was very dynamic, sort of intellectually, even though he was not, college educated and not really a reader. He was somebody who was very thoughtful in his own way.
Yeah. You're very honest in the book about that 3-run, good pitching and 3-run home runs is a winning strategy. But if you don't have people who can pitch well or hit 3-run homers, it isn't. Um, and it reminded me of Moneyball in the sense that I don't think Michael Lewis actually ever told us how great the A's pitching was. So, it wasn't only that people had high on base percentage.
Yeah, yeah. This is
You need the players, right?
this is where the baseball coach part of me kind of butts in because give me talent over brains. I mean, I think like you need it's a physical game. You need people who are really good at it. I mean, yeah, the genius of Michael Lewis was kind of obscuring how classically talented those A's teams were with Miguel Tejada and Eric Chavez and Tim Hudson and Mark Mulder and all these great players who would have been great no matter who was managing them. And it's kind of the same thing for Earl, but Earl, they went through 4 different teams during his tenure, and what's sort of uh, magic about his reign is that he won no matter who he had. So he had a team in the beginning that was full of superstars like Brooks Robinson and Frank Robinson. They left. Then he had a team that had lots of speedsters like Al Bunbury and Rich Coggins. They did not hit home runs. They kept winning. And then he had a team in the end with a bunch of parts like John Lowenstein and Gary Renicky, people who are not very famous anymore. But he put them all together and he kept winning. And so that's what's great about Earl is that no matter who he had, he managed and to put teams together that won. And he also was part of the front office back then. I mean, he would help the general manager build the roster. So, for example, in 1977, they had a young player named Eddie Murray, who the general manager wanted to send back to AAA. And Earl said, no, he's coming to Baltimore, or I'm not going to Baltimore. And so they put Eddie Murray on the Orioles. He was Rookie of the Year and became a Hall of Famer. And so he had this eye for talent and roster construction. That, to your point, I mean, it's uh, baseball is not a game of trick plays. It's a game of finding the right people and letting them play. And so Earl was very good at that too, of building the roster and then setting talent loose, empowering talent. I think is what a great manager does. There's a great quote by Yogi Berra after losing a game in the '64 World Series. The sports writer said, "What are you going to do tomorrow, Yogi?" And Yogi Berra said, "This ain't football. There's no trick plays. You have to just play the game, execute the fundamental tasks better than the other person."
Yeah, yeah. The thing that I like what you've done in telling the story is that it's not a heliography. You know, he comes across as pretty vile at certain times in this book. The one thing that really troubled me reading, because I knew absolutely nothing about it, was the way that he treated the player named Bobby Bonner. And just to give some context, as you point out in the book, early in his career, in fact, before his career began, he was mistreated by Eddie Stanky, who was rather famous back in the day. He was a player manager, and Earl Weaver had a real shot at making the team, but Eddie Stanky decided to play himself rather than Weaver, and that really sent Weaver on a downward spiral. I guess I was hoping that he would be more sympathetic to somebody like Bobby Bonner. Would you mind just talking a little bit about what happened with him and Bonner?
So Bobby Bonner was a young prospect who was considered on the same level as future Hall of Famer Cal Ripken Jr. when he came up in around 1980. And there was this odd tension because Cal Ripken Jr. was essentially part of Earl Weaver's family, or his dad had been with Earl Weaver for decades as a coach and as a player. And so Weaver was terrible to Bobby Bonner. I mean, he basically told him he didn't belong as soon as he got to the major leagues. And Bonner was an evangelical Christian at a time when that was not yet popular in the major leagues. And Earl hazed him, bullied him on the team airplane. Earl would get drunk and call Bonner back to the plane and hector him about his religion. And eventually, Bonner quit baseball. It's not clear to me whether he would have made it as a major league regular in some other organization. But Earl Weaver didn't help for sure, and he was cruel to him. And years later, he was so cruel that he felt himself obligated to apologize to Bonner, who accepted his apology. But yeah, he was capable of cruelty, of hazing players. And part of it was psychological, where he thought, I mean, Doug DeCinces told me, one of his players, Earl thought that if you could handle his bullying, then you would be able to handle batting in the bases loaded against Goose Gossage in the ninth inning.
Mm,
But part of it was also this, hurt people thing, where Earl grew up in a culture where, especially men would haze and bully each other and beat each other. And then Earl Weaver told umpires, I'm going to knock you right on your nose. It wasn't just for comedy. I mean, it was part of a violent culture that he came from and that he was perpetuating and fighting against. I mean, Earl Weaver had a great duality, great light along with darkness. He could be very charming and funny and kind, and he could be violent and cruel. I mean, he once pushed a writer, hoping the writer would hit him, and then he could punch him back, like just because of a story the guy wrote in the paper.
yeah.
He provoked this fight. Um, and he went after players with his fists sometimes. I mean, in the '70s, that's a thing managers did. I mean, famously, Billy Martin and Reggie Jackson threw punches at each other during a game that was caught on camera, and so that was part of the culture then. But yeah, that darkness in the case of Bobby Bonner was something that nowadays would probably get a manager fired immediately.
Yeah. And at what point in your research or your writing did you realize that you were really going to have to emphasize this duality in Weaver's character? That in order to tell the story, um, you were going to have to show that he wasn't really a great guy.
There was a magazine story I found from a magazine called True, which is one of these magazines that probably made a lot of money and had millions of circulation in the '70s. Have you heard of True, Jim?
No, I have not.
It was sort of like a softer version of Playboy, like a men's magazine, but not as racy. But a lot of investigative reporting that was pretty decent. Anyway, they had a story about Earl Weaver in 1974, where they quote current Orioles front office people saying, this guy's a nightmare. He's passing out in the clubhouse. He's vomiting in hotel lobbies. And when I read that piece, I just sort of saw the immediacy of and the real problem with his behavior as it was experienced by people around him. And so I didn't want to do a book where I chase up anecdotes from his personal life, and I wanted to keep it about the baseball, about the how he behaved himself in the baseball context. Well, here was direct evidence of him being a real problem, but the same people would be quoted as saying, "Well, we can't fire him because he's winning."
Right, that's
and,
right.
and so when I read that piece, I thought I have to deal with this head on. I asked his family about it. It was, part of the casual alcoholism at the time. I mean, a lot of people in his family uh, had problems with drinking, so that's why it didn't really make sense to discuss the family and his marriages in too much detail because it was a systemic problem where there was drinking, there was fighting, but everybody was kind of involved. And his daughter told me, Terry, she said, he used to say, everybody needs a crutch, and drinking is my crutch. So he knew he had a problem. He never really dealt with it. In today's game, that would have kept him out of a job for sure. It was really messy. I mean, players told me stories like he would pass out on the plane and they'd put a cigarette in his mouth and he'd choke on the smoke and wake up. Um, Interestingly, the only player who would not tell stories about Earl's drinking was Cal Ripken Jr.
Mm,
Partly because Cal's a superstar and he's very media trained and et cetera, but also because Earl's kind of like family to him. He's kind of like a favorite uncle, you know. And so yeah, he was protected. But again, that true investigative magazine story that opened a whole new world for me for understanding how big a problem it was, even at the time, and even by the standards of the day, which were pretty loose.
yeah. You mentioned media training and Cal Ripken Jr. The one thing that, well, many things came to mind, but one thing that came to my mind repeatedly was how many colorful characters there are in the book. Um, I don't think of the Orioles as being as wild as the Bronx Bombers of the Billy Martin years or Charlie Finley's A's, but apparently there were a lot of people who were very witty and quick-tongued in the Orioles during the Weaver years, and you just don't see that kind of colorful behavior coming from players nowadays.
Yeah, you sure don't. I have covered contemporary Major League Baseball, and there's too much money at stake, and the players are so well media trained, and they're pretty boring. I love the old ball players I'd talked to. I mean, they were uninhibited in telling stories, and part of the wit was all these great beat writers who were covering the Orioles back in the '70s, like Tom Boswell for the Washington Post, and Peter Pasquarelli and Dan Shaughnessy. Um, who in their own writing and reporting would chronicle, these great conflicts in the team, like famously Jim Palmer, the Orioles star pitcher, and Earl Weaver. They would fight with each other, and then they would go back to the beat writers and tell their stories about the conflicts. So the conflicts were part of the narrative of the team in a way that now, like the front office would just squash. There you wouldn't let a team be consumed by this narrative of drama, but it was kind of encouraged as part of the spectacle of baseball back then. And Earl would say things to the press that were just really witty and funny, like, we're playing so bad right now that back-to-back home runs means one home run today and one next week. Or we've crawled out of more coffins than Bela Lugosi. Um, and yeah, just a lot of good one-liners and repartee, and it was a time of they turned a tape recorder on, and the coaches or the managers and players would just talk for minutes and minutes and hours, and then you just pick out the best quotes. And now it's like 30 seconds, and you say one cliche and you're done. But yeah, I love that part of the book too, which is the kind of great witty repartee of sports back then.
Well, now the manager meets the reporters at a press conference after the game, right? The reporters don't necessarily get in the clubhouse anymore.
They do, but it's very short. Yeah, and Earl
Right.
Weaver he would have them in his office, and he would be naked eating fried chicken, drinking a beer, and then he would get up to pee, and he would keep on talking to the reporters, while he was urinating.
Well,
Um,
I love this. Actually, I highlighted this because I want to read this. You in one paragraph, you so perfectly capture what it was like to be a reporter covering Earl Weaver. You write, after games, Weaver sometimes held court in the nude, smoking Raleighs, drinking Schlitz with salt, and munching on fried chicken. There was a urinal next to the manager's office, and Earl could continue his soliloquies while peeing. The daily Earl Weaver baseball lectures spiced newspaper stories and educated beat writers while turning Earl Weaver into a widely quoted folk hero. So there we are. We're right there.
yeah, yeah.
We're right
I mean,
there. That's
I'm somebody who loves journalism too, so I love the craft of journalism. I love the old fashioned beat reporting ethos of being there and seeing things. So I was sort of paying homage to that too.
right. Without saying I,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
The reader knows you were there, but you don't plow beat the reader with it. So let me get to the this issue here. Do you like Earl Weaver?
Yes, I do. I wrestle with this, and as I was kind of looking at this nuance and duality, I thought, if this is really a terrible person, I couldn't spend years doing this book. And there was the kind of red line for me of domestic abuse, that if I had found out that he had physically assaulted his wife, I could not have done the book. So
Right.
that was kind of a test for me, and I did not find that. I talked to a lot of people in his family, and I read all the police reports and everything from his DUIs and such, and did not find evidence of that. And his kids liked him, and so I guess those things kind of reassured me. I loved his family; like they were such charming, funny, kind people, just very working class American, down to earth, who I really came to love, and they loved the book in the end, and so the kind of vibe around that reassured me that this was somebody who had, even if only slightly more light than darkness. And also the beat writers like Terry Pluto, who wrote he ghost wrote the Weaver on Strategy, and Terry talked to me and he said, you don't please don't write that he was a terrible person. He was very kind to me, very sweet, and all these writers who loved him also kind of reassured me.
And we also can say that he treated white and black ball players alike.
That was something else too. Yeah, because somebody like him, I mean, I heard from his family that when he was younger, he used the N-word. Like there was a real racism inherent in the culture he came from, and he evolved and he changed. And black players told me how much they loved him, and says that that was a very kind of neat and inspiring story. Also shows you the complexity of race in America that in today's parlance, he might have been canceled, but then he evolved. So there's room for growth in people like that.
Well, speaking of evolution, the portrait you have of him holding court in his office, um, he had to change that when women sports writers came around,
He
and he
did,
did.
and he did not handle it well at all. In the beginning, he was very cruel to the first few women who showed up. He asked them for hall passes from their fathers. He, called one a lesbian. I mean, there was a real, again, violence to his initial reaction there. But as the years went on, he welcomed women, and a few of them told me that he was very kind to them when they started on the beat and reporting and covering the Orioles. So again, yeah, there's a complexity there where Earl Weaver is never just one thing.
Yeah, I think the Earl Weaver that I take away from your book is that he wasn't testing people. It wasn't a strategy. That he really was mean-spirited,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
grew out of it.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
how do you assess the experience of writing this book?
Um, I would say it's not to sound overly dramatic or cliche, but it's kind of my life's work in that I've dedicated my life really to two things. I mean, writing professionally, I mean, writing and baseball. I've done professional jobs in baseball too. And so this is stuff I've thought about for 30 years, and I found a good subject. And, uh, it's a dream come true too. I mean, um, it's one of these projects where everything has kind of worked out. And I've done a lot of different creative things in my life, and sometimes you try stuff and it doesn't work. And this project, it has worked, and I think it's because I have just put the time in of reading and thinking and obsessing over baseball for decades. If I had to do anything differently, uh, I don't think I could. I mean, I think I would. You always like want like another pass at the material, and there's a few typos in the book and some things I wish I had worded more cleanly. But I hired a fact checker. I did all this stuff to try to make sure it would not be picked apart by baseball bloggers and not make any really dumb mistakes. Um, and so it was a lot of work. I felt called to it. I felt like there's nothing like this where I could do this again. Like it's not just a professional project where I uh, sat down and decided to write a book. It was something I've felt within me for years, and therefore very satisfying in the end. And my publisher keeps on telling me, you have to realize how lucky you are that it's on the bestseller list and it's gotten all these great reviews. And I do feel lucky. I do feel like I got lucky, and I feel very grateful for that. Does that answer your question?
No, it does for sure. Did your is your agent and publisher prompting you to take on another project?
I talked to my agent, is Eric Lupfer, who has done a lot of books with Wall Street Journal people. And he told me I should wait for inspiration. And so that's what I'm doing. I don't really have another project. I mean, it's 3 or 4 years of work. And then I'm very conscious of the fact that this could have not worked out. And, there was a time when I was failing to sell it. And it's actually interesting narratively. My initial idea was to write a book about how great the 70s Orioles were and to kind of do like a money ball for the 70s Orioles and Earl Weaver and explain why they were so successful. And that version of the proposal was not selling. What changed it was when Jonathan Eig, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who's also at the Wall Street Journal, he said you have to make it more about his failures. And so when I shifted the narrative arc to be about the years in the minors and the hardscrabble St. Louis childhood, and the payoff was the 70s Orioles, that version sold pretty quickly. And so, but again, the process being this tortuous and long and difficult, I really have to feel deeply in love with an idea before pursuing a book. And like this is a bestseller, but it's not making me rich. Like it's still the book industry. Like um, it's not something that's going to save you from working.
What? What? My guest on this episode of Writers at Work has been John W. Miller, author of The Last Manager, How Earl Weaver Tricked, Tormented, and Reinvented Baseball. I love the book, John, and thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.